So I shoulder surf when a buddy of mine is watching videos, and sometimes I have him pause the video so that I can add some commentary. It's a process that I think I ought to record, but we don't really have the setup to do that. Maybe in the future. Um, and he was playing a video by Cockbite. Oh, I mean Rooster Teeth about accessibility in gaming, and I've got a number of rather strong opinions on that. And I don't know that they're going to be any different from what's already been thrown around. So I'll add a link to the video, of course. And so I'm going to go through some of the points. I took just a gentle number of notes. So the very first, because I kind of was paying attention starting it halfway through the video. So this is I just rewatched it to add some more notes and stuff like that. So who knows how this is going to go. My first initial thought was the argument of a free market versus forcing by government intervention, the free market, taming them into regulation, essentially. So let's say toning that down and making it, when a game is released on Xbox, should it have a certain set of disability features? And I said, well, yeah, Microsoft should be forcing games to have certain accessibility options. Absolutely. Now, that's against the spirit of the free market, and there must be dozens of players out there, a whole new market that a game can cater to. But frankly, a free market doesn't give a damn about the extra 2 or 3 players out there that will require the weekend of developer time by that intern. They will make some stupid cold decisions. You might say, okay, well, that AAA game might exclude an audience. That audience will just, the free market, them being free, will just say, well, we'll just go get it from AAA company B. But you're going to run out of AAA companies. And, well, maybe one of those companies is going to decide that they're virtuous, and they will signal to the world that they're so virtuous, and they will add in disability features. And it's just going to be a matter of marketing. Understanding how big business works is you don't see things the way everyday people see things once you understand what pushes, what drives individual companies, or let's call it a AAA demographic of developers. Okay, so let me go through some of my notes. Is it hard to add disability functionality? Probably not. I mean, the common example, and this is one of the problems I've got with the disability argument, is colorblindness. Oh, there are so many people who are colorblind. Yeah, okay. But they're not catering to that audience isn't necessarily the same as catering to other audiences, is it? So for example, somebody who's got a particular issue with the number of objects on the screen that are moving at the same time, that's not quite the same as like a color template change or something like this. That's not the same as having a toggle in the engine that changes the colors around. Making changes to the game that removes the amount of blood, okay, that's one thing. That's actually not that hard. That's a leftover from 1980s arcade games, really. But there would be other things that would be legitimately difficult to do. And so the market would say, well, maybe the market would do this, maybe it would do that, maybe this company would be virtuous, and maybe this company wouldn't have the resources, maybe it would be too hard for this game. But the fact is that that regulation at a middle point has to exist, because a free market doesn't have moral actors, and regulation exists that I'm against libertarianism for this reason, that there is a circumstance where the majority or the holders of, let's call it power, the holders of the tyranny of the AAA developers, they're the ones that create those games, where they have to be forced to do certain things. And that's against the concept of a free market. And I think that has to happen because we've got minorities who will be unable to participate in a certain hobby. And you might think, okay, well, it is kind of a slippery slope. I mean, having the power to force that, giving the power to a minority to have them force a majority, not necessarily a majority in number, but have them force a significant influencer to perform certain actions. That is an incredibly dangerous thing from all kinds of angles. But ethically speaking, I mean, it kind of has to happen. There needs to be some sort of way to have the ethics forcefully instilled in large companies. And the traditional way would be to have the saviors of the minority dogpile on the companies, and they would act with their wallets. In a free market, that's how you do things. But these people would probably, dogpile and insult and write fake articles and harass, bully on behalf of the poor little disabled people, and they would be the saviors, and they would do it for their own virtuous signaling. And that's kind of how a free market would work now, because of the tiny minority that may not actually be able to speak for themselves. Fine, there's I mean, I use some pretty harsh language to describe the way a lot of actors act. But ultimately speaking, somebody like Microsoft would need to signal their virtue and force their companies on their platform to have at least a certain minimum standard. Now, the minimum standard is never going to be enough, because games have unique challenges that they need to solve, that have to do with the way their game is. There's a uniqueness in both the game engine and in a particular game and its gameplay that make it, you can't just change like a stamina slider and have that be like, well, that solves disability issue A. Well, that doesn't necessarily do it. There might be more that needs to be done in certain games, maybe, right? Number of objects on the screen, maybe the timing of certain things, maybe, and it's more than just button mapping. And I do want to get into button mapping, because one of the notions is that less needs to be done by games developers than people seem to think. And that is something like a remappable controller. Well, you have a controller that has profiles, and you just pick a different profile on the controller. The solution is hardware. And that must be the case for a lot of disabilities. There are specialized devices. There are people who can't type, so instead of having a keyboard, they have a twiddler, and where they use a thumb and a couple of fingers as a keyboard. And this is actual thing I knew about for decades ago now. And I never thought of it as being an accessibility thing, because people were saying how it's just easier on the hands, right? And years of typing has been the idea that it would hurt a person's hands has been an idea that's been around for a very long time. So that's a thing I've had in mind for a long time. So the alternate controller thing, it's a hardware solution for a lot of just input devices. So why force developers to do anything? The free market will just have third-party companies creating specialized controllers that will do things. So for example, there are cheat boxes for an Xbox, let's say, which will let you use a keyboard and mouse for first-person shooters. which is completely cheating. A lot of people will make a comparison between keyboard and mouse on a PC and versus controllers on a console. And one of the reasons why you don't have cross-platform play is because PCs are better. Because a person with a mouse and keyboard is going to have snappier ranges of motion, supposedly. And so how do you have people... Now, that's an interesting thing that I just thought of right now, is when you've got people who have access to accessibility enhancements that let them play. Well, there are going to be circumstances where now in a competitive environment, they're better because of it. And you could just say that an able-bodied person can take those controls and can be even better than they were because those controls make it easier to, let's say, to target. So if they have snappier targeting because of what they're doing, because of that controller versus the original controller, then all the competition who are using the standard interface can't compete with the person with the superior interface. So there's an argument to be made there that the playing field isn't level because, well, the playing field isn't level. That's kind of, one of the problems that people have, I think it's a problem when people think of input devices and physical, let's call it physical impairment, generically speaking. When people think that competitive players across, let's say, a game, let's just make it one platform. So we're not talking about like Xbox, PlayStation, cross-platform, anything like that. Just let's say Xbox, that everybody is using the same hardware and same controller in the same game. We're going to play pretend like all things are the same, that there's this thing called skill, where that's the competition is happening in skill. But we all know that's not true, because there's going to be that person with a terrible latency, and they're going to have a harder time. And so games already have to do some nuances to deal with the disability of somebody who has a poor net connection. And maybe it's through no fault of their own. Just like an actual disability, maybe a person has poorer reflexes, right? A person with a poorer net connection because maybe they're rich, but it doesn't matter if you're rich. If you live in certain places, you still can't get a net connection that's as good as somebody in some other place. Maybe they're just closer to the servers and they get a better response time out of stuff. There's already mechanisms in the background for a game to just like quietly cater to the latency disabled. And there's something to be said there where, well, it isn't skill now. You're also dealing with certain disabilities in technology, but you've still got disabilities in physicality or it's the brain is still physical, so that point still stands. So extending that out is pretty intuitive. Like if I were to talk about competition and say that it's unfair that such and such a controller or whatever, well, sorry, like life's not, we can't play pretend like all humans are the same such that there can ever be a fair playing field on any axis at all. And latency is just one that is exactly the same as is it insulting for me to say it's exactly the same as a physical disability? Because it's just difference in people, and it's the exact same as this person can only play at a certain time of day and they're tired. That is compared to typical exhaustion level people. That is a disability, but people don't see it that way. So it's really weird how we might have a culture of typical people they don't see themselves as being in these axes of ability. They just see skill. And they look at they other these other people, this minority, this really extreme minority, many of which nobody even knows exist at all. Like it's one, like I know a guy who can't see color at all. Like I have trouble comprehending that concept. I mean, I can understand blindness and I can understand deafness. I can't understand color blindness to all color. It's it's something I hadn't heard of before meeting him. Like how it's so learning about somebody who's got certain other disabilities because they just have a brain that's that way, right? It's not like not like the person fell down, hit their head, and now they have an injury, and that's right. It's not like missing a hand by accident. It's not something we can understand. It's just some new thing. I think that taking competition as a way of understanding the topic and understanding tiredness and latency, right? And understanding that it isn't skill, that's not the measure, that's not the line that we place all of our competitors on. That it's not just those everyday things, that there's all kinds of other considerations that can be made. And so there's an opportunity to normalize the notion of the competition. Maybe that's an extreme concept that I want to walk back from, because we're just talking about playing. Maybe we're just talking about competition between the player and the game, or the mechanics of the game, and removing the barriers that at least removing the barriers that entirely prevent people from playing. So you could say, well, in a free market, a AAA game will just get shamed into it, or they'll smarten up and they'll be virtuous ahead of time and just be, oh yeah, we're totally accepting and whatever. And one of the challenges is, if regulation is a concept that exists in any capacity, say it was at the platform or the console, so like Xbox, so Microsoft, they become virtuous and say, well, we're going to make sure that we have a set of standards. Well, now you've got a miniature industry of you've got a regulation industry. And this is one of the problems. Talk to a libertarian. This is one of the problems of having regulation at all, is now you've got a specialized interest group who focuses on two things. One thing is the thing they were founded to do, and the next thing is on themselves. Perpetuation. So if they are a group of auditors that represent, they're the saviors for an entire demographic to make sure that things go a certain way, well, they're going to keep pushing for things to go a certain way. And they're going to skew everything in that direction. And they're going to get funding and, hey, guys, we're virtuous, give us money. We're the bestest. Look, we're representing all these poor people and give us more money. And they're making six figures and stuff like that. And they're this perpetual little mini industry that's there being, they're like parasitic to an industry having inserted themselves in a place. Like, oh, we're the focus group that makes sure that all red meat is a certain shade of red, because that's really important aesthetically because of reasons, and they're just some legacy leftover thing because of something else, and because certification is now necessary, and because there's perception of this or that, because they've paid to have that perception propagated out there, like whatever stupid things make that. There's this thorn that gets put there that might have been the right thing to do ahead of time, right? But later on, it's a part of culture just to have accessibility. But we have no mechanism of getting rid of any of those thorns. They become a tax on games to support those people for a feature that we all know is going to be there anyway. So humans have no way of creating regulatory bodies and then having those regulatory bodies dissolve when they are no longer necessary. That's the problem I have with the idea of regulation. Is I think it's a necessary evil. I do think it's evil. I think it's a necessary evil because I would rather have that than the dogpiling virtuous bullies who go in and be the saviors for these poor demographics who need their help. I mean, that might be true to some extent, but don't infantilize people. And maybe adding regulations would be important to force it, but there's no mechanism to take that and prevent it from metastasizing into this weird cancerous thing that's just going to be there for the entire duration of all of humanity. Is now going to have this. You need to have that little sticker on the box that says, A for accessibility, or is that already an ESRB rating? Sorry. Okay, so back to my notes. So I probably made my point there already. Yeah, I think I did make my point. I'm gonna stop there. So the general notion is accessibility to the 5 people that have the disability. I mean, a free market won't care. And you can play pretend like, oh, there are millions. Okay, there are millions all over the world. That's weasel words. All over the world doesn't play games necessarily. All over the world isn't in the market. Isn't the demographic for a AAA game necessarily. I'm betting somebody who says all over the world is also happening to include people with color blindness as a disability, which, I mean, that's nowhere near the same as a whole lot of other things. I think disability is more than just what we would consider somebody who's got like a deformity or who's injured. I think it also has to do with somebody who's technologically disabled. I mean, like, how awesome is your video card? You can't play that game. That's a technological disability. It really is. But there are settings to help you with your disability. You can't play at 4K, right? So you can't play at 4K 120 FPS, which is insane. I can't see at 4K 120 FPS. There's just no point. I don't have a video card that can do that because I would need a walk-in freezer to put that thing in. And so I need to turn the settings down. Well, how different is that from turning other settings down in the game for somebody who has a mental handicap for processing certain information? Well, I can't physically see at 4K, and I don't have a video card that can process at 4K. I need things toned down so that I don't, whatever the heck, right? So there are going to be some people who would have seizures or something because of certain influences in the game, and there just needs to be a setting. Some games need to be modified for that. And yeah, so physical and technological disabilities are exactly the same. We've already got the mechanisms in place to feel a certain way about the mechanics in games and to feel a certain way about players, even in the face of competition. And I think it's just a trivial little step to go from not all people are equal. Some people are going to be incredible at playing certain kinds of games, certain kinds of game modes at certain days. And we consider perfectly normal for somebody to be, they're young, they're new at the game, they're tired, right? They haven't eaten. And for that to be normal person stuff. And yeah, that's going to make a person less competitive, obviously. And there are going to be some people where they've been playing games like that since they were 6. And you can be, okay, well, yeah, I just picked up the game that they're going to be better than me. And it's okay. And how the difference in typical people, the typical differences in typical people isn't so different than the typical differences between technology or the difference between any of that and somebody with, let's say, an everyday, understandable, not particularly complicated disability like color blindness, and the difference between any of that and somebody who has a greater disability of like motor function or brain or vision or something like that. Well, it's possible to take the normalcy of our capturing the broader audience of people with those normal disabilities to just broaden it a little bit more to people that have what we other as being disabilities, right? Not to downplay any of the challenges that exist there. I mean, you haven't had your morning cup of coffee. You're technically a little bit disabled, right? Just but using the same wording for that does take away from the actual lack of ability of somebody who doesn't have both thumbs, right? That they're going to have a harder time than you without a cup of coffee, right? So I want to take the word and I am intentionally watering it down in order to make it relatable by everyday people. Okay, so I think I've made my point. Maybe kind of accidentally. I'm not really sure. Okay,